Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin Heath, and I'm the Senior Communications Associate for the French American Chamber of Commerce, New York chapter, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here today for our webinar, Diplomacy in the Age of a Pandemic, featuring our guest speaker, former Ambassador Gérard Araud, and discussion led by Stephen Dreyfuss. To begin, a quick word about our organization for any of you new participants out there. The French American Chamber of Commerce's mission is to provide the networks and opportunities, experiences, and understandings that empower successful business relationships between and for members. Through international training programs for young professionals, trade services, and networking opportunities, we foster the development of individuals and companies. The New York chapter counts a mosaic of over 1,000 members and is part of a national network of 18 regional chapters. In addition, FACC members have complimentary access to webinars featuring top industry experts and leaders, as well as personalized member-to-member introductions, and of course, access to the FACC member directory. Now, a few housekeeping items to take care of. The webinar will last an hour with about 40 minutes of presentation followed by Q&A. As attendees, you can type questions while the presentation is underway. Please make full use of this, and the Q&A will be addressed at the end of the session. You will receive a copy of the recording, so don't worry about taking notes or missing anything. In addition, at the end of this webinar, members will receive a link to view other member attendees and can connect from there. If we do have any connection issues, please bear with us. We ask that you stay on the line and we will switch the ambassador to audio connection only. Now, I am pleased to hand over discussion to Stephen Dreyfuss, Executive Vice President of the FACC New York and former President of the Paris-based Union Internationale des Avocats and partner at Hellring, Lindeman, Goldstein, and Siegal. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Caitlin. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar of the French American Chamber. As Caitlin indicated, I'm a lawyer and Executive Vice President of the Chamber. I'll be discussing with Ambassador Araud a number of issues that we think will be of interest to our French American audience. Since he left the diplomatic service in mid-2019, after 5 years as ambassador to the United States, following 5 years before that as UN ambassador, Ambassador Araud has been a frequent commentator on international issues in France and in the United States. As those of you who, like me, follow his Twitter feed know, he can always be counted on to provide his frank and no-holds-barred assessment of the issues of the day. We expect no less this afternoon. Most recently, as you know, Ambassador Araud is the author of a remarkable memoir of his 40 years in the French diplomatic service. It's called Passeport Diplomatique, 40 ans au Quai d'Orsay. It may be reversed on your view, but there it is. Otherwise known as Diplomatic Passport, 40 years at the Quai d'Orsay. There are many things that could be said about this book, and have been, but in my view, its analysis of the events of the last 40 years reflects the most acute understanding of the United States, the functioning of its government, and especially the mentality of its people that I have ever read from a non-American author. For those of you who read French, it should not be missed, and for the rest, perhaps we can hope for a translation. Let's start with the topic of our webinar, diplomacy in the age of pandemic. We've all read and heard in the media for the last several months, and all the more so now, that we are faced with a choice. Either keeping our health safe from the virus by keeping our schools, businesses, and government closed, shut down while we self-confine at home, or else opening up our country in order to start restoring our economy so that people can go back to work and support their families. The same debate is going on in France. Are we deconfining too soon or too late, too fast or too slow? Mr. Araud has a different view. As he tweeted about 3 or 4 days ago, and this is my own translation from the French, I quote, "This dichotomy between economy and health is not only infantile, it's false. There is no health policy without a prosperous economy. One of the wounds of confinement has been this parade of platitudes. Good feelings don't make good policy." End of quote. So, Mr. Ambassador, are we all talking about the wrong thing? Tell us why.
No, You know, when you are facing so first, thank you for the invitation and hello to everybody, you know, really, which is through this mean of communication. No, first, when you are facing a challenge, when you are facing a crisis, you have always a natural trend to overestimate its importance. And I may be really a bit provocative, but I think that in itself, the virus, the pandemic, is not that important. You know, really, it's awful. One fatality is too much. But even if there are 150,000 fatalities in the US, it won't change anything in the functioning of the country. So what is much more important, and that's the reason why I was insisting in the tweet you were quoting about the economy, is the fact that we are entering a recession, and we simply don't know what will be the cost of the recession. Whether it will last 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, we don't know. And there is an important element is that this crisis is coming on the top of another crisis. We were just out of the 2008 economic crisis. Our societies have been traumatized by the crisis. And on these societies, you have a new shock. It's not by chance that all the Western societies were facing the challenge of populism. And suddenly you have a new shock coming, really traumatizing again, if I may say, our democratic societies. And what I have to say about what the crisis is bringing to our societies, it is that it's not creating trends, it's amplifying already underlying trends that we had in the Western societies. In a sense, some people are saying, you know, the life will not be the way it was before. Unfortunately, my conclusion would be, yes, it won't be the same way it was before, it will be worse. Because when you are looking at the trends which were already in our societies, that you can identify with left-wing or right-wing populism, you had the insistence, you know, the fight against free trade, the insistence about that borders are important, the fact that multilateral organizations are useless and even actually have a negative role, that the experts and the elite are totally ineffective, that the traditional parties are not able to face the real challenge of our times. If you look at all these elements, unfortunately, when referring to the virus, referring to the crisis that we are facing, you can say, well, it's exactly what we told you. Free trade has really brought dependence on China. Borders, you know, would have protected us from the epidemics. The elites have been obviously totally ineffective to protect our societies. The World Health Organization has been ineffective. The European Union has been effective. The United Nations have been ineffective. And the only protection that we have are the nation states. So again, I think my first conclusion would be that actually we will unfortunately reinforce the negative forces which were that we had in our societies, and especially under the guise of populism, right-wing populism or left-wing populism. And it will be much more difficult to advocate open societies, free trade, than it was still, and it was already difficult before the crisis, but it will be still more difficult after the crisis.
Well, that's an interesting way to transition to one of the points that you make toward the end of your book. You write at the end of the book that the United States, far from seeking to maintain its role as policeman of the world, its traditional post-war role, is in retreat on the world scene as a result, not only, you say, of fatigue from endless conflicts like Afghanistan and Iraq, but also based on its own questioning whether this traditional post-war role for the US is still in the US national interest. And you take care to say that you're not talking only about President Trump, but also about President Obama's reluctance to commit the US to foreign intervention in certain instances. And you say that both presidents seem to have sensed that this was the mood of their country. Now, up until now, China has sought to step into the global leadership role as the US stepped out. And Europe, I think it's fair to say, has often been reluctant to criticize the Chinese, in part because of the trade and financial dependence that you mentioned. And this might have been shown a few weeks ago when there was a European External Affairs report that seems to have been watered down in its criticism of China before publication. But now Europe seems to be most recently joining in the criticism of China, most recently yesterday at the World Health Organization meeting. So how do you think the pandemic changes that situation if it does? Do you see the US role in the world continuing to shrink? Will we look back on China's role in the origin of the pandemic as a turning point in the relationship of among the great powers of the world, or is this just going to be a detail?
A lot of questions. I think we need a few hours to be together. A few hours. First question is whether the pandemics have changed the geopolitical balance of the world, and it may have changed in two manners. First, changing the balance of power between the main actors, or secondly, changing the behavior of the main actors. Changing the balance of power between the US and China, no. The coronavirus is not going to change it. And whatever the people are saying, they are really, I think, widely underestimating the American power and overestimating the Chinese power. I think they forget that actually China is facing a lot of problems. Hundreds of millions of Chinese are still living in abject poverty. The Chinese state companies are burdened by debt, and China is facing a demographic shock because of the one-child policy in 20 years that actually we have been really facing for 1 century, and without any social security and without any insurance. And there is also other elements that I think we don't have to forget. Also the weaknesses of China. China is not a sort of, really omnipotent giant on its way to world domination. It's a large country, but a large country which is facing its own challenges. No, the second problem is that China was still around 1750, the main power in the world. And now, in a sense, China is back as a great power. And it's always difficult when you have in a geopolitical system, basically, that you have an emerging power and a sort of a relative declining power. The power of the United States in declining in relative terms only because China is emerging. So we have to accommodate China in the new, in a sort of a new world balance. And it's always difficult. It's always difficult because China coming wants a lot. And of course, the other countries, be the US, be Japan, don't want to give a lot. So there are tensions in our geopolitical systems, and our tension, we will have tensions in the.
I'm afraid we have a sound problem.
So, apologies, if everyone could just hang on just a few minutes, we'll have the ambassador.
The ambassador will switch to telephone. That was a predicted loss of video. Are you back, Mr. Ambassador?
No, not yet.
Yes. Well, I hear you.
Oh, you hear me from the? I think it's from the computer.
Well, why don't you, whatever it's from, why don't you resume?
Okay, I'm going. So I said I'm really sorry. What I was saying was that we are in a very difficult moment where you have to adjust the world balance between an emerging power and other powers, US, Japan, and others, which are in a sort of relative decline. So it's a difficult moment. Third element is that in the US there is now a sort of a consensus, an emerging consensus, which is beyond the Republican Party, to say that China is actually a long-term strategic rival of the United States. And so I do believe that whoever is elected in November will consider that the US has to challenge China. And as you are saying, it's unavoidable that the American administration will come to the Europeans and saying, choose your camp. Now there is a sort of, not exactly a Cold War, and I will come back to that, but there is a sort of a Cold War between China and the US, and Europeans have to choose their camps. And it will be extremely difficult to the Europeans to take a decision, because first, it's always difficult for an European to take a decision, the Europeans to take a decision, but also because Europeans have different interests in their relationship with China. So they will have to find a way of conciliate on one side their values, their relationship with the US, but also their legitimate material interest. Last point, people are talking of a Cold War. We can't have a Cold War between the US and China for the simple reason that the two economies are so linked, so intertwined, that which was not the case at all between the USSR and the US, that it will be a new kind, actually, a new kind of competition, a new kind of rivalry that the two sides will have to manage. And they have a strong interest of managing it. Look at China. Really, China is the second, I think, holder of treasury bonds of the US outside of the US. So the Chinese have no interest actually to make really to challenge the financial situation of the US. Or China has a surplus of $360 billion with the US, and so on and so on. So it will be a new kind of competition. Competition is a normal state of the relationship between states, but the two administrations, the two states, will have to be very prudent in their management of this, what will be for the coming decades the critical foreign relationship in the world.
Now, you have said recently that you do not think that America's retreat from the world, or retreat from world leadership, if you want to speak that way, will change after the next election. But I heard you say that, nevertheless, you think that either president, whether it's President Trump or President Biden, will want other countries, including Europe, to pick a side. Do you still feel that way, that America is not going to try to resume its post-war role in the world, or do you think that's changed?
I think that President Obama and President Trump, coming from very different corners of the American political life, have felt the fatigue of the American public opinion towards military intervention, endless military intervention, which cost not only the life of the soldiers, but also hundreds of billions of dollars for a very disappointing result. And you saw it in Iraq, and you are seeing it right now in Afghanistan, where the Americans are desperately trying to get out of it without letting behind them a total mess. So it started with President Obama. I don't know any other crisis since 1945, like the Ukraine crisis, for instance, where basically the Americans didn't intervene. And it's it's in Europe. It's a country of 52 million of inhabitants. It's an obvious foreign aggression, and basically the Americans really led the French and the Germans trying to find a negotiated solution, but they remained very carefully out of the crisis, and Trump did the same. Syria also, basically, 500,000 of people have been killed, but you can add Libya, really, or also what is happening in Northern Africa. So you have all a series of conflicts where basically the US has concluded that its major interests were not at stake, and it was to the countries, to the local or the regional countries or regional powers to take care of it. And I have not felt any significant change between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, even if the manners have dramatically changed. And I don't see if Joe Biden is elected, I don't see him sending the GIs in Ukraine or in Syria. So I really, and I don't think that you will want to pursue the 18 years war in Afghanistan, either. So I think for the Europeans, what does it mean? No, I'm convinced that if the Russian tanks were attacking Estonia, and they won't, but if they were, actually the Americans will fulfill their obligations under the Article 5 of the NATO Treaty and will contribute to the common defense of the NATO members. I think that's not the problem. The problem is that obviously the periphery of Europe is in flames. Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Northern Africa, and basically the Americans don't care. Basically, the Americans are telling us, really sorry, Europeans, but it's not our interests are not at stake. And I think the Americans are right. So it's basically to the European to react, and it's basically what President Macron has been saying for 2 years, saying we should be able to basically to act in our backyard, the Middle East and Libya, for obvious reasons, are our backyard. So let's do something. Let's have the means of doing something. But so far, I think the Europeans so far have been living in the sort of denial. Basically, the Europeans have been are so much used to the transatlantic cooperation, to the role of the US as the policeman of the world, that they consider more or less that Trump is a sort of a nightmare which will vanish, and that there will be Joe Biden, and we will come back to business as usual, to the policy of the Americans, that the US really, the American policy since 1945. And there, I think they are wrong. I think, of course, if Joe Biden is coming, he will be much more courteous. He will come, he will hug everybody because he is Joe Biden. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the Americans are going to take care of the European security the way they did it they have been doing it for the last 70 years.
Well, so since we have a French-American audience, I'd like to turn to your views on the outlook for French-American relations from at least now until the next election and then potentially thereafter. I think it's fair to say that President Macron was widely seen here to have handled his relationship with President Trump with great skill, especially at the time of the president's trip to Paris in 2017 for the 14 Juillet, and also at their bilateral meeting in Paris in November of 2018. What's your view of their relationship today? And do you expect the French-American relationship to change substantially depending on the outcome of the US election?
It's difficult, and I have experienced it as an ambassador to Washington. It's difficult to build a relationship with this administration. It's difficult simply because there is only one person deciding in Washington, D.C., which is the president. The president basically has an utter contempt for the bureaucracy. He doesn't rely on the bureaucracy. So in the U.S. administration, the U.S. Department of State, a lot of offices are still empty after 3 years. And if they are not empty, the person there actually has just arrived or is going to leave. There is an incredible turnover of high civil servants in the Trump administration. And basically, they don't know what the president will say the day after and what means what the president has said the day before. So it means that very often, when I was asked by Paris to transmit a message or to ask a question, I was obliged to say,
Have we lost the signal?
Seems like we have. Please bear with us for just a moment. We'll give him a second, maybe dialing back in by phone.
Yep.
Basically, it's what Emmanuel Macron has done and has succeeded to do. After that, you can say, oh, there have been bumps on the road, but there have been bumps with all the world leaders. And there was one bump, I remember, in November 2018, after the centennial of the First World War. And basically, Donald Trump made some anti-Macron tweets when flying back to the US. I called the White House and the people told me, oh, don't worry. Basically, every world leader has had this special treatment. It was an outburst of bad mood. It will be forgotten in a few hours. So again, that's the particular management of a Trump administration. It's necessary for the French president, but I think it's the same with the other leaders to have a direct line with President Trump, and I think that Emmanuel Macron has succeeded to do it. Afterwards, to talk about French relationship with the US, I think the election on November the 3rd will be, maybe for Europeans, maybe the most important election in the US since the election of FDR in 1932, because really we will be at a fork. If Donald Trump is re-elected, which is quite possible, basically knowing him, he will go to the end of the road in terms of his vision of the world. And we know the vision of the world, which is America first, which means America alone. He doesn't care about alliances. He considers that the EU is an enemy. So I can bet, and I can bet a lot of money that there will be a trade war against the European Union. He believes only in the balance of power, in the raw balance of power, and he doesn't have any attraction to the notion of the West. So basically, we will be in a world of, I should say, a jungle of power politics based off the balance of power. And of course, it will be quite a challenge for the Europeans, first because they believe in values, they believe in multilateralism, and secondly, most of them have given up the idea of balance of power and have, in a sense, sacrificed their defense. So it will be, for Europeans in terms of value politics, and also really in reality, it will be quite a challenge, and it will be up to them to react. So if Joe Biden is elected, of course, we are in a much more traditional situation. It doesn't mean, as I've already said, that basically Joe Biden will go back to the policy followed by his predecessors. You have heard also on the left, actually, you have heard people around Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren who have repeatedly said that they don't want to have an America which is interfering with the domestic politics of the other countries, and which are totally opposed to military interventions. And Biden was the vice president of Barack Obama, who was also, as I've said, also quite reluctant to launch military intervention. So it will be much more friendly. I think there will be also more cooperation, also more trust into the multilateral institutions. So it will be quite different, but fundamentally there will be the same challenge for Europeans to act on the world scene.
In the 5 or so minutes we have left until we were planning to open up to questions, I wanted to talk about Europe in the light of what you've just said about the potential relationship between Europe and the United States. Paradoxically, it seems that the pandemic, at least as of yesterday, seems to have resulted in unexpected cohesion in Europe, if we can judge from the Franco-German announcement of their intention or their approval of the idea of this 500 billion euro fund designed to aid various countries in Europe with their recovery. It was only a few weeks ago or a few months ago at most that Thomas Piketty of the French economist has been talking about advocating Eurobond issues by groups of countries within the European Union, such as France and Spain and Italy and Greece, perhaps. But no one, even Piketty, ever anticipated that the Germans would be in favor of such a move. Do you think that this is a real turning point for Europe, and that we are now on the way, slowly perhaps, toward getting a real European budgetary authority and a real European common financial system along the lines of what the United States currently has?
Well, actually, of course, it's a positive development. The Franco-German agreement allowing the European Union actually to borrow money, really 500 billion euros, to make grants actually to the countries which have been the most struck by the economic crisis. It's you know, what is striking with Chancellor Merkel is that she eventually always take the good decision, but it's eventually, which means that it's a bit late, and it's really step by step. It's very incremental. No, the problem is that remains the fundamental fragility of the Eurozone, which is that it's a monetary union without a fiscal, budgetary aspect. So very often I try to explain, you know, basically between Greece and Germany, it's the same, more or less the same difference that between Massachusetts and Alabama. But between Massachusetts and Alabama, the money is flowing from the former to the later in a very discrete way through the federal budget. So the people of Massachusetts are not asked every year to sign a check to the people of Alabama. And in the Eurozone, it's exactly what happens. Basically, in the Eurozone, considering that we don't have a real budget, it means that when there is a problem, it's basically every German has to know that 2,000 or 3,000 euros of what he considers as his money is going to be transferred to the Greeks, the Italians, or the Spaniards. So politically, it is really unsustainable. So every time that the European Union is submitted to what they call in economy, I think, an asymmetrical shock, we are back to the same comedy. We are back to the same people in the north saying, oh, we don't want to give our
Seem to have lost our signal again, have we?
It seems so. Once again, he should be back shortly, and then we're going to segue into questions in just a moment.
I think he.
It will be borrowed money and with the guarantee of all the member states. So that's, I think, a good point. But unfortunately, I think that the EU is going to muddle through again and again, and it will do it as long as it has not a real significant common budget. And apparently, we are not yet here.
And I suppose if we judge at least from the view of the German Constitutional Court, we may not be there very soon in terms of the independence of the European Central Bank from national authorities. But that is perhaps too broad a topic to launch at this point. I think, Caitlin, at this point, we were going to go to questions. Have you received any questions? I don't hear you.
Oh, hi, I do have some questions.
Okay.
Thank you all for spinning. If you have any more, feel free to enter them in the chat box now. We do have a few more minutes. So, Mr. Ambassador, you referenced this election in 2020 being historic, and also some similarities with FDR in 1932. FDR's New Deal programs, of course, were very significant in helping the U.S. recover from the Great Depression. In contrast with recent stimulus packages such as the PPP program from the U.S. Small Business Administration, which has been criticized as too short-sighted. Do you believe we have fully grasped the scale of this pandemic and the forces necessary to turn the course of the economy?
No, I think we have not grasped, the seriousness of the situation, because in a sense, we are all under painkillers. What I mean, painkillers, really in Europe, as you know, most of the people have been furloughed, are paid by the state, and basically for them, for most of the people, for 90% of the people who had a job, basically it was 6 or 8 weeks of confinement, but basically they are paid. So now that we are opening up the European economies, we are going to lose our painkillers, and suddenly we are going to realize how really devastating or how not devastating has been the crisis. The painkillers are less powerful in the US, but nevertheless, with the decisions taken by the Congress of $600 a week till end of July and so on, I think the worst part, the worst pain has not yet been inflicted. So when suddenly Americans and Europeans will discover the situation, the economic situation, personally, I'm extremely worried. Really, I'm, on the block, I am living on the Upper East Side in New York. On my block, 4 stores have announced they are closing. Apparently, people say 25% of the restaurants are not going to reopen. And we know that the industry of services has been the most seriously hit, and it's the industry which is providing also most jobs. So there is a lot of question marks. So when people are trying to say, oh, after the coronavirus, the world will be so and so, to be frank, I am extremely prudent, because what if we are facing a crisis as serious as the 1929 crisis? On the top of the crisis of 2008, what is going to happen? We know that it has always political consequences, always. That so in some, and we have also to think that most of our democracies have already been weakened by the populist outburst. So what will happen in Italy, for instance, where the far right has been knocking at the door for some time, where the GDP has been stagnating for a decade, and which has been seriously hit by the disease, and which considers that actually it has been let down by the European Union. So I think we have a lot of questions, And like in a theater, we are going to open the curtains, and we are going suddenly to see how is the world. And right now, we don't know. Right now, really, I do think that our political authorities and the central banks actually have done their best, and they have been quite bold. They have reacted quickly, and I think they have done a lot. I'm quite convinced that, again, when the curtains are open on the stage, and when we are going to look at the devastation, I'm sure that our political authorities will feel obliged to react. The pity is, of course, that they are not going to react in a coordinated way, and I'm talking especially between the US and the Europeans. I think it doesn't make sense, but that's a reality. The Europeans are working on their side, and the Americans are on their side. And you have a lot of questions which are beyond the economy. You have the question of the virus, whether actually the virus is going to vanish or is going to strike back in October, whether we are going to find an antiviral or whether a vaccine. So there is a lot of, and also a lot of questions on the virus itself. So there is, I think, for me, when people are asking me questions about the future, I am answering by a big question mark. Really a big question mark. First, we as individuals, we don't know whether we will be allowed to travel in 15 days, but more seriously, question mark about the future of our economy and also the political future of our societies. I don't speak about the US, but I think in Europe, for instance, we could have nasty surprises.
That's very true.
Now, let me just jump in on that to ask you about your view of how France in particular has handled the virus thus far. It has been, its situation has been significantly different from certain countries. Comparisons have been drawn with Germany. There has been some suggestion that Germany handled it better than France. There's some debate about that. But what do you think the impact going forward on President Macron and the confidence of the French people in their government is going to be as a result of the manner in which France has reacted to the virus thus far?
So I think, anyway, the simple expression, the confidence of the French into their government, in a sense, is a contradiction in the terms. Yeah. Because the French never trust their government. They always criticize the government, and as soon as it's raining, they rush to the government to ask for an umbrella. So it's a national, it's more or less a national really feature that Tocqueville was already emphasizing. I don't think that the French authorities have handled the issue better or worse than their neighbors. Germany is an exception. Obviously, Germany has better handled the issue. But you see the figures of Italy and the UK are worse, slightly worse. Spain also, Belgium also, but basically it's more or less the same. We have been totally surprised, overwhelmed by the unexpected virus.
Let's give him another moment.
Mr. Ambassador, you're back with us.
And on the 3rd of November in this country, whether the electors or the voters are going to take the president, be Macron or Boris Johnson or and so on, as a scapegoat of the disaster, or whether they will conclude that after all he has done his best and it was not that bad, and that I really don't know. I think it would be in a part irrational, but it's such an amazing crisis, without any precedent, that really we don't know. We don't know where will be the American economy on the 3rd of November. We don't know what will be the conclusions drawn by the American voters. And in France, it's the same. In France, you have to add another element, is that the president was already weakened by the yellow vest protest. So there was already tensions in the French society. So it will, of course, add a new layer of discontent or protest in the political situation. Having said that, the French elections are in 2022, so the French have still time to protest before voting.
Okay, Caitlin, go ahead.
Yes, maybe one more. So one of our questions was, you mentioned the turnover of civil servants. And so obviously this was an immediate problem when some of the postings were not filled in certain embassies. But how do you see this reverberating over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of policy continuity and loss of experience of these career professionals?
I think for me, what is interesting in the situation is that it's basically the Trump administration in traditional administrative terms is totally dysfunctional. And because again, the offices are empty, the procedures are not respected. The US, contrary to what a lot of people believe, is quite a bureaucratic country with heavy procedures. The decision-making process in Washington usually is a nightmare. You have meetings and meetings and meetings, and eventually you have a meeting which is called the principals at the White House with the deputy of the main administration, and it's going to the cabinet itself. All these procedures doesn't exist anymore. The president is taking his decisions from his hip, and we don't know why, we don't know on which basis, and after that, nobody knows really what does it mean. But instead, the difference I've always had with my American friends, because for me, I'm not emotionally committed by what is happening in the US, has been to try to analyze it beyond the person of the president. And that's really, I do believe that when you are a populist president, it means something. It means that you want to make politics in a different way. And you do it against the establishment. And a part of the establishment is the bureaucracy. When you are a president, you arrive, and when you are asking, usually you ask options to the bureaucracy. That's the job of the bureaucracy, to prepare options for the decision. And basically, if you are a different politician, you receive options which are always more or less the same. Options center-right, options center-left, but in a sort of limited scope of decisions. And Donald Trump is different. Donald Trump wants to take decisions out of the usual scope of the Washington bubble decision-making process. So I think that when you have a populist leader, you are doomed more or less to have this infighting between the president and what he has called the deep state, the traditional bureaucracy. I think it's part of the populist leader really action plan. Really he has to break some China because he simply is different. So he has to govern in a different way. It doesn't make the life of the ambassadors very easy, but I think the ambassadors are not the real standard of Donald Trump, and that's the reason why what I said. It's very important to have a direct relationship with the only person who matters, which is President Trump.
Thank you. I think we're going to say a few words of conclusion. Stephen, did you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think there were many other issues that we could speak about, particularly the role of Emmanuel Macron in the Europe that is emerging. I think that before the pandemic, we were all saying that he was the heir apparent as the leader of Europe. The British were out. Merkel was a lame duck. and Macron was flourishing. I'm not sure that everybody would say the same today, so that the leadership of Europe, I think, is in nearly as much flux as the leadership of the United States. And as you say, we can't predict the future, but I found this to be an absolutely fascinating discussion. You have obviously unparalleled expertise and experience in the areas that we've been discussing. On behalf of the Chamber, I do want to thank you very, very much for giving your time and your ideas to all of us this afternoon.